Say thank you all for coming in. Just a very brief introduction to Greg Lynn, someone you all know well, a frequent visitor here. What we're doing this afternoon is taking an opportunity to discuss the launch of Greg's new book, this beautiful brick that's arrived quite recently here and in other places around the world, which is a document of about 13, 14 years of his work in the office that he runs, Greg Lynn FORM. We thought it a perfect opportunity to invite Greg back to discuss not just the contents of the book and his interest in the work, but really the broader conversation that it engages today, which is, let's say, the relationship between bodies of work in studios, the production of books that describe that work, and the various forms of expertise that play a part of that. And we'll be joined this afternoon by Mark Rappolt, Kjell, and Robert Violette, all of whom were quite closely involved with Greg in the production of this book. And we're going to have a discussion about it after Greg briefly introduces some of his interest in relation to it right now. So we're going to show a few images, or rather Greg is going to show a few images and talk briefly about the topic of publications in his work, and then I'll invite the guys over. We'll lift the screen up so we all have a bit of room around the table here, and then have a discussion about it. Greg?
Sounds great. Okay, well, so maybe I'll introduce everybody when they sit down. But what I thought I would do to just kick things off is show a few plates from books that I've, not to say I've done, but worked on. The very first one was Animate Form. I didn't even check dates on this stuff. 1999. So Animate Form I would describe as a text with illustrations. It was more than half of it an argument about the history of movement and animation in architecture, then looking at art history, some examples from science, people like Wolf Lin, who wrote about movement and animation in architecture from the position of art history, a discussion of mathematics and calculus and how that was changing the design medium. But it was a historical and theoretical text, at the end of which I illustrated with some examples of my work. Now, in the late 90s, I would say this was a fairly conventional approach to a publication. I was a younger person then too, which might play into some of it, but I actually think it wasn't a question of age or maturity. It was more a question of the intellectual milieu and the context of architectural ideas, that you would do something which was a theoretical and art historical treatise with forays into science and kind of bad art but good science, like Muybridge and people like that. But it was very much the de rigueur for what was going on. Later on, I did this catalog for a show I curated called Intricacy, and I'd never curated anything before, and thought that I would try to make an argument about the role of architectural detail and tectonics and the dialogue between primarily sculpture, but also photography and painting and architecture. And this was a show at the Institute of Contemporary Art, and the catalog was trying to make an image-based argument about the work. So the principle of intricacy I broke down into 3 different categories, which I won't go into. But in the catalog, those 3 different categories were juxtaposed one to another in what was a very, I think, brilliant design strategy where the book would unfold with images that would sometimes take multiple pages as you would unfold them. So there were some formats, like here you're seeing juxtapositions of the back side of a sheet against the front side of a sheet that were center folded and gate folded. And this is one that would unfold 4 times. So you'd see pieces of a David Reed against pieces of a Roxy Payne or something like that because of the way the book was designed. And it did have text, had probably, I don't know, 4,000 or 5,000 words of text in it, but the text was more like an extended caption. And the captions for the work had a lot of the concepts implicit in them. So it was really an image-based or graphic argument. So these 2 publications I wouldn't have wanted to do again twice. Like I wouldn't have wanted to do the theoretical treatise with image illustrations. I wouldn't want to do the image argument with extended captions. So that's what brought us to what was unaffectionately called the monograph for a long time, which I don't know why, but I was very allergic to the concept of doing a monograph. And maybe I think that's one of the things we should probably talk about on the panel. But the way we organize this, and I have to say it was Robert who talked me into doing the book. I mean, I'm not like a difficult person. I just didn't want to do a book. Didn't sound like fun. And Mark had been saying we should do a book, we should do a book. And I kept saying, yeah, like in 10 years, let's talk about doing a book. And then he introduced me to Robert. And Robert laid this Paul Smith book on me, like a monograph. And I was really knocked out by the way Robert had edited and put together the Paul Smith book about Paul Smith and his work in the studio and his fashion house, and just was very intelligent. I don't know if everybody knows it, but I'd encourage you all.
The new edition just arrived.
Oh, there we go. Hey, look at that. And like all new editions, you figured out how to do it in a paperback. So, but it's an amazing document. It has everything from like microscopic lists of every object Paul Smith ever owned since he was like, I don't know, a teenager, to photographs that he'd take every day above his desk, and just a great insight into a creative process. And really, I thought I knew something about Paul Smith, and I looked at the book Robert had done, and I just was, it was a very deep, interesting, and diverse book. So that's when we started having this conversation about how to structure a book. And just to real quickly, so there's some context, talk about how we ended up structuring it, is unlike a chronological monograph. We ripped the thing apart into topics. I think concepts would be too strong a word. I would say topics. So topics like structure, aperture, color, massing, these were all headlines that we would then rip things apart and put them together in those headlines. And then as a way of putting them in a context, invited contributors to come in and contribute. So the contributors weren't asked to write about a project or me or anything like that, but to write about the topic, like geometry. So we got a mathematician to write on geometry. And maybe and Mark's introduction clarifies that. So when you come into the book, the only thing that helps you navigate it is Mark's introduction, where he talks both biographically and autobiographically, as well as putting all of the contributors into a context. And also for me, the audience is very important when you do a publication, and the audience for Animate Form was graduate students and a few faculty members and even fewer architects that were friends of mine. So I would say when I did the intricacy catalog, it was a slightly different audience, which was really the people in the show, meaning fine artists and architects and historians and theorists. I think for this book, I really wanted to have, I do put a lot of effort to have friends that aren't architects and friends that I admire for their creativity, and also colleagues. So I tried to get the colleagues and friends in the book in some way that it was significant and helped the argument, including a photographer, Ari Markopoulos, who just started taking pictures for like 2 years before we did the book. And so Ari's pictures are at every break in the book. But so as an example, let me go. Let's say to the geometry section. You know, here Peter Schroeder wrote a text on corner cutting and Chaikin's algorithms, which is the underlying system to what probably most of you use for modeling, whether it's with polygons or with splines. And Peter, for the first time, did diagrams and screen captures and things like that. And it's a very technical text. It's accessible for anybody in the room, I'm sure. But it's really just about geometry. But so then when we put together the chapter with images and extended captions, we tried to pick those images which related directly to some of what Peter's text was about and also indirectly on what some of the text was about. Very similar thing with surfaces. Chris Bangle did a contribution, and you know, I was very happy with it because it was not specifically about any of the work here. It was in general about the fact that car designers really care a lot about surfaces, and their surfaces have to be perfect. But that all car designers do is make perfect surfaces. They actually don't have any ideas about their surfaces, so for their ideas they look to architects, and for surfaces, architects should look to automobile designers. So it was a more general argument, and the book is full of those kinds of texts that are to a larger audience, and to an audience of architects, but also audiences of designers and artists and intellectuals. So anyway, I think hopefully that sets a kind of 3 periods of publications that I've been involved with, but I think might be generalizable or not. Okay, so to introduce everybody, Mark Rappolt is the person that's responsible for the whole book, because it was Mark that really wanted to do it and get it done, and I've known Mark since he was running the Triangle Bookshop here at the AA like forever ago. Before, I mean, probably the first place that had animate form on the shelves was the Triangle Bookshop because of Mark. So, and Mark is now, he's edited I would say the most influential art magazines in London and Europe, and probably now is editing the magazine, which is more, what would you call it? The, not the gold standard, but the document of record. He wouldn't say that. He would call it like some kind of gossip rag, but it's really the document of record for the art world that took over from Art Forum for that a while ago. But so Mark is here as the editor of the book. Robert, I've already talked about. Robert has his own imprint and also works on all kinds of books. I'm sure he's going to bring a lot of his experiences and anecdotes to that. Kjell designed the book, and all of the graphic design, as well as the editing, is Kjell. I mean, poor Kjell, like, Mark would come to LA with these portable hard drives and, like, crash every computer within 5 miles and bring them to Kjell, and Kjell was the one that had to make the visual argument for the book. Brett, you all are absolutely intimate with, and that's it. So let's have a conversation.
Nick, can we lift the seats? Yeah.
Yes. One second.
I think Greg has in a way laid the plate perfectly for us, and by showing this book in particular in the context of previous books and writings that he's known for, and I think that will be one of the topics today, most certainly, which is the difference between a monograph, if that's what we want to call it for a moment, and these other categories of printed books. But I think before that sort of broader discussion, it might just be interesting to turn to the guys and briefly each of you could contribute something on what I think is the other important topic for the day, which is what it means to take the work of the studio and put it, for a studio with the name FORM attached to it, and to bring that work into the form of a book like this. So the project of its production, and maybe I'll turn to Mark first, who I know says many things in the introduction, to take the editorial lead, as editors do. And one of the very nice things that Mark says in the introduction is that the conversation for this book did start here when Mark gets an opportunity to meet Greg in this room over an event that I think we had here. I'm going to guess in about 1999.
Something like that.
So it does have a very interesting kind. It's rewarding for it to come back here in the form that it does. But I think maybe if you could just start the conversation with how you two begin talking, and then pull in everyone else, and then each of you could talk about the production for a bit.
Well, I think when we first met, I wasn't necessarily a fan of Greg's work. But that kind of somehow evolved into an ongoing discussion that we were having through various magazines, principally, for a number of years. And it'd always come up that Greg didn't have a book, that almost for my convenience as a journalist, that it wasn't something I could just pull off the shelf and get all of Greg. So that was the initial, I guess, impulse to do a book. But then making a book is, I think, all about negotiations. So it was initially a negotiation with Greg about actually doing it. And sometimes we're both good at prevaricating, so it sort of took quite a while. And then negotiation with a publisher who would want to do a book. And you get all kinds of pressures from a publisher, such as Rizzoli, who published this, which aims to actually sell the book, not just produce it. And they had, I think, various things they wanted, lots of pictures, every single work in chronological order. And we had to negotiate with them that perhaps there was another way and a better way, which is where Robert came in as a sort of intermediary and protector from our evil publishers.
Sometimes I felt a bit like the fence, right? Yeah, to warn you. Sometimes I didn't really do any work on this book. It was all done by these guys, and also by a young editor at Rizzoli called Young, who's responsible for their architecture list. And I have some comments from him I'll share with you later. But sometimes my role was to be a bit like the fence in between, to keep Rizzoli away from you guys, and to warn you when the cops were coming and that kind of thing. It was a Greg is an enormously busy man, so to produce a book like this it requires a huge amount of time, more than anything else, because the images exist. It's all the information is there, the intelligence is there. And when Mark and Kjell and Greg sit down to plan something, it's just really time. And in Greg's life, that's probably the most precious commodity. But I was very much a cheerleader and observer in this, and so Mark should talk.
Well, I guess, from the beginning, there wasn't really a plan. And maybe the first 6 months of working on the book, we're trying to work out what the plan was.
We spent more time talking about what it wasn't going to be than what it was going to be. And actually, not in defense of Rizzoli, but to make sure it's a balanced thing, because Robert, you were kind of like the defender of the integrity of the book, but I think Rizzoli was pretty open to rethinking. I mean, it's very lucrative to do Richard Meyer or Levin or whatever it is that their bread and butter is, as well as Around the World in Chocolate or whatever, those kinds of coffee table books. And I think we really tried to say that this would be related but different than either one of those. And they seemed to be, they were open to it. There are other publishers that weren't. I mean, that's why we landed with Rizzoli.
But also, I think trying to do a book that isn't necessarily just an architecture book is quite hard, because, I mean, essentially they're wanting it to be bought by graduate students, all of them. And if you try and do a book that has artists, fiction writers, car designers in it, it can be a bit of a struggle as a commercial project. But I think actually the whole concept of the book really came together when Kjell and the designers got involved, because until then it was something that was just in our heads and on some strange emails. and some really scrappy bits of paper.
I mean, it might be useful just to mention, just for the audience to understand something about the war strategy of arriving at this. What kind of a time frame are we talking about? How long have you guys been talking before Kjell has rung up? I mean, just to give people a sense of what it means to produce a monograph, which is, I think, one of the interesting features of that kind of publication versus magazines, catalogs, a collection of essays. I mean, is it the length of a building project? Is it a 5-year project? Is it?
Turned out not to be, because you were starting a building when we started the project, and you didn't finish it by the end, right?
Didn't make it yet.
Huh.
But I think it was about 1.5 years of discussion.
Okay.
And then part of that discussion was choosing a designer as well.
Sure.
I think it must have been more because we were involved for at least 1.5 years. So it was interesting for us. We got the brief and it was very streamlined. The production schedule was 6 months and everything. We would have the material that day and then the first proofs that, and so everything was lined up for the publication. And by the time the first proof should have arrived, there hadn't been delivered any material. So we sort of got used to working with architects in a funny kind of way. We also felt that when we took on, we don't design that many books, but when we took on this, part of the allure to do it was that it was not structured as a normal monograph, but more as a concept, which meant that we could inject more of a voice into it rather than if it all was just to display project after project chronologically, we would have had to step a lot more back from it, I think.
Also, we got this email the other day from Kjell and John. They won like 1 million, like every award you could win as far as I could tell. For graphic design, you won for the graphic design of the book.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah, it's been recognized as a good piece of graphic design. I don't know if it's won every award it
Was that because you
can.
had more time, or was that because you had more time to percolate on it, or what do you think that was?
No, I don't think so. I think you can do something quite quickly. I don't think it has to go for a long period in order to do something good. We are used to working a lot faster than we did on this particular book, and towards the end, when it all really came together, that was because one of your assistants in LA actually took responsibility. Yeah. And if it wasn't for an architectural assistant, this book would probably still have been in production, I would say.
Architects are deadline-driven creatures. Yeah.
Yes.
Have you worked with architects or designers before, and how did Kjell get it roped into the project?
We haven't. No, we haven't. And we don't do that many books, and we hadn't done an architecture book, which was another plus. We are both myself and John are interested in architecture.
Yeah.
And
it was Mark actually who brought you into the
Yes,
picture
yeah.
because
Yeah.
Mark has fairly significant radar when it comes to seeking out new and interesting talent or artists or work or places. And I wasn't aware of Untitled's work, non-format work. And I don't know where you first found out about non-format, but
Well, they do a lot of magazine design. We rebranded The Wire.
yeah.
Of course.
And I think we kind of felt that we didn't want someone who just bangs out books
Great.
doing the design, and it had to be someone who'd contribute something new to the project, which we hoped he would, and he did, through not having really worked in the field before. But I think it was a very involved process in kind of working out which designer would be right, both because as an architect, Greg has a sort of, I guess, a style and an aesthetic, and you want a designer who's got their own one but doesn't compete with the architect's one as well.
It's very typical, like animate form. You know, we designed in the office, which I would never ever want to do that again. But it was actually, you'll all find out if you do a book. Publishers like to offload the design, the copy editing, proof editing, all of that stuff onto architects for some reason. I don't know if they do that to any other fields. I don't think so.
I don't do it.
No, you don't. You don't. No, but I know when we did the fetish book as graduate students, you know, the graduate students designed the book, and picked out the fonts and did all the copy editing and proofreading and stuff. So I don't know. I don't feel particularly skilled to do any of those things.
And I think there are an awful lot of architects who do imagine themselves to be the perfect art director, and it just seems to be built into the field that architects think they can do it themselves. I think in your comments on it not being, let's say, the latest version of Richard Meyer's monograph, which begins as a series in 1984 with a deliberate decision to kind of go make it an inside job with the appointment of Vignelli, who of course knows architectural culture, and particularly New York architectural culture very well. I'm struck by what sounds like a very deliberate decision to make it, let's say,
Offshore?
Yes, to move it outside of a kind of architectural or disciplinary form of expertise, let's say.
Yes. And I think that model of the oeuvre complete, where you keep adding the volume and it's seamless and timeless, it goes with that architecture. I mean, it goes with Richard's architecture. It makes sense, and
Absolutely.
it's right. But I wanted to try to find a way to do something that made a little more sense and was a little more right for this stuff. So, but I don't know if that's the difference. I think it's also the audience is different now. Although none of us actually know if we've even sold any of these books yet. So they don't.
So the Architectural Association is maybe not necessarily the perfect place to be today. It should be a different kind of association, I'm sure. I think it isn't just let's say, a Meyer-centric view of the architectural monograph. If you take the history of the form, which you could say starts in the early 20th century with Frank Lloyd Wright's career being reinvented around the Vossmuth, which he does in-house in the model that you're describing, Max Bill converting Le Corbusier's complete works, again in a kind of in-house operation, or rather someone trained within his world. I think you can track all the way through. Johnson in '46 with Mies. The only example I can think of overtly would be someone like the Venturi's decision to reach towards someone like Muriel Cooper in the graphic design world, deliberately outside of what they know within architecture, to try and create this sort of a mix. And I wonder if there are other examples you might have looked at, or if there might be, in thinking of Mark's world, if there are examples in the category of art monograph that gave you ideas. I guess the question has to do with what's our context here. And I think a beautiful first context is the one that Greg shows, which is this book is going to be different than 2 or 3 other books that have tried to develop the work outside the studio. The collection of essays, animate form, the catalog. That's a kind of micro-architectural context, in fact, a very autobiographical one. Is there a context that deliberately connects to something going on in the graphic design world or in the art world that offers a counter-model of monographs?
I think not so much unless you took the exhibition catalogue, which maybe is a good example. And Intricacy was an exhibition catalogue. And I think, but most of it came about through looking at how Greg works in a way, that he doesn't... If you read a lot of monographs, you get this idea that an architect sits in a studio and then shazam, the idea comes, and then it goes on paper. And we really wanted something that could capture the idea that Greg's part of a wider community with all kinds of different people involved. And I guess it's trying to give as accurate a portrait of how he works as you can without overtly describing he gets up at 6 o'clock and whatever.
I think this might be a good moment to share Rizzoli's perspective on this, because this is exploding it out to a more generic context, the opposite end where Greg is coming from. And Jung, I asked him to send me some comments about the book and Rizzoli's perspective on publishing this for today. And he sent me some interesting notes. My perspective, because I publish only a couple of books a year, for me the purpose to do the book is to work or be exposed to people like Greg or other artists, and the profit is in the editorial process and making the book. I don't really make much money from the actual publishing. Rizzoli, on the other hand, publish 400 books a year. They employ a lot of people. It's a very different situation. So I asked him for his perspective on this, and he said, this is what he said: architectural publishing is a strange beast, probably the most retrograde and strict of all book publishing formats. But it could be the thing that will save it as print shrinks to a minuscule portion of what it has been. I think what he's saying there is that for architecture and for a lot of other arts, sometimes the only record of something might be what ends up in book form, or that you need a more complete record or an anthological record of something that you can't replicate on a website. he goes on and says that most architectural books resist easy translation into digital form. I'm not so sure about that. And I think one of the appeals about Greg's book and other books that interest me, either in making them or books that I buy, are books that have to exist, books that can't exist either as a website or in some other medium, books where you have to navigate through them, or that have a way of organizing the content that's unique to pages between covers, instead of just using the book as a vessel. You know, sometimes books should just be vessels. There are a lot of books out there, a lot of books in your shop here that don't need to exist as books, that could be much, much better, in fact, as a website, where you could have moving images and sound. And that's one of the bugbears for me with books, is that we can't have moving images and sound in books. A couple of other things that Jung says is, no one has failed to notice how the architectural monograph has got bigger and bigger physically over the years. And he says that Greg's monograph was an effort to combat some of those tendencies and also adhere to others. So how to make a body of work that is, at this point, mainly digital to be more real, how to convey an ethic of construction and detailing through this book and through the book form, as well as the content. And he sees Greg Lynn FORM as being quite unique in those approaches, certainly in so far as it was tailored to Greg's peculiarities. The rest is unique, and he hopes indicative of the future of architectural publishing. And I think the credit for all of that goes down to these three guys and the support you had in the office. Because in the end, it's really quite a simple object. And that's sometimes one of the frustrating things about books for me these days, is that books get overcomplicated. They get too contrived, and it takes a lot of effort to make the opposite appear true. So congratulations for making that possible.
I'm curious to know what you think about how it was working with us, because it was tense. And I mean, maybe specifically because of the imagery and the nature of the imagery as well, and the incompleteness.
Well, the first year was very frustrating, but the last 6 months is really when sort of the book came together. And it was, I mean, we created a structure for which we knew that our part of, like, designing the typeface, which luckily Greg was happy to embrace, and those kind of things were already in place. And then we had a structure for the rest of the book that was open for Greg to change his mind. So we would get emails back saying this needs to shift and that needs to shift, and we made sure that the structure of the book was done in a way that it was possible for us to do that. So we didn't put any kind of design signature on every page. We sort of kept that to the headline pages. That's where we kind of injected the expression of the object itself. And then everything else was very much open to changing as the ideas changed it. And so I mean, it was frustrating until, like I say, until the architectural assistant came on board and all the images actually started to fall into place. The only thing we had from the publisher was there's two typefaces used in the book, and at the start off we only used one, which is a little bit, it's like a 60s computer font, and the publisher asked us to change it because it didn't feel academic enough. So that's the only interference from Rizzoli on specific part of the book. The other thing is, of course, the material that you make the book from. We had other wishes for the paper, and in the end it was made in China, and we had to get paper samples from China, and all these kind of things that you have a vision of what you want, and then you get the reality of these are the materials you can choose from. So it's kind of, you get a certain amount of compromises along the way from the publisher from an economic point of view.
I think the other weird thing that throws up is the fact that, despite the fact that Greg's done publications in-house before, all the material in his office isn't set up to be easily published. And it's just like diving into a swamp of random images, missing images, forgotten projects.
Things in formats for software that doesn't even exist anymore.
Mhm.
They had a lot of that. No, I mean, you do something 15 years old, you have to go back to this, like, fire up some silicon graphics machine and see if you can still boot the hard disk up to grab things off of it.
Which obviously raises interesting questions about the status of the archive today within studios generally, and
Yeah.
how they relate to this kind of form that was created in effect around a completely different kind of archive. I think, I just had a thought, and I'm wondering, is this the first time you all have sat down around a table to talk about this thing? I'm curious how that experience, when did it come to an end? Just
You mean
remind us.
when we worked on it? Did
Yeah.
we ever get together in person?
No, afterwards,
Oh.
after the thing is sitting on the table, I'm curious, is this a first conversation with the thing
Yeah.
here?
Yeah.
Or is it
With
awkward in any way?
I don't feel it's awkward.
No. It'd be worse if it wasn't here.
Yeah. If it
We
wasn't
had
here, we'd
some
still have the conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, because I think it does raise an interesting question, of course, about how, and I think maybe the most overt example I can think of within architectural discourses would be the trauma that someone like Venturi Scott Brown go through with the second edition of Learning from Las Vegas, the famous story of taking every property in the first edition and reversing it. So instead of expensive, collectible, refined, large format, it's cheap paperback, accessible, and it was the argument of the book. It's part of everyday culture. Let's just take it out, do the cheap paperback copy. And I'm wondering if they're thinking particularly of Greg's interest in this idea of structured or intelligent variation. The entire topic of editions, in fact, is maybe potentially in different terms and in terms that resonate with the kind of ideas in the work, i.e. that things are within families. And I can remember Bruce Mao's presentation here of I guess it was Lifestyle a few years ago, where he deliberately designs the book with eight different covers, you know, and wanted to just see which one sells well to try and work out his world of audience. And if in fact there's a series of topics within the production of the book that can now in some way go back and inform the various practices on their own. I'm curious if it's led to yet that kind of reflection. Did the experience, to think of it separate, to think of the relation between the production of the book and the body of work, does it now feed back into your own works as an editor, as a inventor of book projects, as a graphic designer of them, or as someone working in the studio now operating in a slightly different way? Many architects have talked about the trauma of doing the monograph and it shifting their thinking in some way.
Well, I would, this is again more kind of, not businessy, but specific, but because I did the Visionaire case for that Hedi Slimane book, the first discussions, not with Rizzoli, but with other publishers about doing a book was always, you know, we're going to give you this amount of extra money to CNC mill a cover.
Sure.
And I just thought, like, is that the stupidest thing ever? Is that what I want to be known as? Like, the guy with the really annoying cover that, like, falls apart and, you know, cuts up, you know, your dog wants to eat or whatever it would be. Like, I didn't want to do the CNC covered art edition book.
Yeah.
And there was definitely a lot of pressure. I mean, that was actually how that was like the second sentence in the conversation with 2 or 3 publishers was we really want you to do a custom book cover.
Yeah.
And so I think for me this was, you know, the only thing that was anything like that is John and Kjell wanted to do a foil. Your idea was a foil, no? And we had a blue foil, and my daughter walked in with this pink foil Japanese T-shirt, and I said, the pink looks a lot better than the blue, and so then we got a sample of the pink and decided to do half in pink, half in blue. That was the only thing that has that kind of edition quality to it. But I would say that it's, for me, the book is like Robert was saying, it's an old medium.
Yeah.
And it's an old medium you can innovate in, but that I think you also, it's fun to connect with the fact that it's an old medium in some way, and turning it into a collectible edition thing is one way to renovate the medium, but it's not, it didn't seem right. Despite the Visionaire thing, it didn't seem right to try to do that.
One way to think of the way the book resonates directly with the studio is, and Mark points it out in the introduction, the peculiarities of Southern California culture and your interest in working across aeronautical, automobile, and other kinds of manufacturing industries deliberately outside of architecture this table, in a way, is a record of that interest going into the book form, which is to reach out to graphic design, architectural editing, 6,000 miles away, and to construct it across a much more complex landscape of interest and expertise, arguably. And I'm wondering if any of that was available locally, if it was deliberately meant to be a kind of global, international enterprise, or if you had any strategy at all for it, or if you all just meet one another at various parties and say, let's do it.
It was kind of random in some ways, I think. But I think it was more about looking for the right people to achieve the project, really.
I think empathy is a really important and powerful thing. I'm sure it's the same for architects, but certainly when you're going to spend a number of years working on a book with someone, particularly with artists or architects or other creatives, it's a very personal, emotional thing for them. And when you can find empathetic people like Mark and Greg are, and Mark and I are, that counts for a lot. And so when you search for a designer, for example, it's not just because John and Kjell have done great work of this kind of style or mode for other kinds of practitioners, but because there's also a feeling there. And that's really important because, you know, Greg will have sat down with any number of publishers, or with the Paul Smith book. Paul, as you imagine, was approached by everybody to do a book. Mm-hmm. And for him, it was always, let's do a kind of year chronological collection of all the things, and or an autobiography, and he wasn't interested in that. But and I didn't have any ideas when I first talked to him, but there was a sympathy for a feeling for an ambition, and I think that's something that you know, Mark and Greg shared right from the beginning, and I was very happy to get involved in the mix, not just because of how remarkable Greg's work is and what a giant he is in his field, but because there was a clear empathy. And I think when things get really stressful, like in an architecture project, you need that. You have to have that. Otherwise, things can get pretty rough. And
which also, I still actually haven't gotten to know Kjell or John so well. That was a geographical liability that we didn't get to be close friends. But for example, when Mark proposed 3 or 4, there was a lot of discussion with Rizzoli where they said, look, the designer needs to be in LA. Like, the editor can be in London, the designer needs to be in LA because the designer needs to sit there and pull all the images out of the office and have feedback. And I thought it was better to have a real editor, like a person that actually edits the book. And so I thought it was better for Mark to feel comfortable with whoever the designer was, have him be locally, and that was a thing we did have a little bit of a thing with Rizzoli about. And I liked Non-Format's work very much when I saw it, and Mark showed me a couple other examples of designers that he was working with on his magazines and stuff, and he said, look, you know, I think, you know, Non-Format is the best design for the book, and I also really like John and Kjell, and I've worked with them before, and so I was just like, you know, that's your decision. I mean, I like the work a lot, but it was really Mark's decision. Same thing even with the font. I knew that was a real delicate thing, and Mark was like, you know, in like 8 days, we're going to get this font, and you're going to see it, and there's like a whole countdown to the font, and the font came, and I thought, you know, what do I know about fonts? You know, I don't want like a...
Well, we decided we didn't want to use grotesque.
No, that's the one you would know. There's another font we use in animate form. Yeah, it's like it's like an albatross or something if you're an architect and pick a font. Yeah. So, anyway, I just, you know, I deferred on some of those things, and I think that's an important part of doing a project with the ambition to have a lot of tentacles. Yeah. Is you have to be deferring to people that you know are professionals. So.
Although again, architects have a hard time with that.
Really?
Sometimes, yeah. Wanting to be in control of everything. Another question that's often asked about the monograph form is, what doesn't make it in the book? And in fact, is there stuff that gets cut, and we might want to talk briefly about that experience, or is it meant, as I think it was introduced briefly, as a fairly exhaustive survey? I think I can remember one of my teams a few years ago doing the map of what part of 20 years of OMA actually gets quite brutally cut out of SML XL, despite its 1,400 pages of images. And in fact, it's a very, very carefully choreographed telling of the story about a set of interests over 20 years. And I'm curious if that ever became an overt topic amongst you, if some of you looked at work and said, look, that project not interesting, or we defer to Greg as the author of the work to make decisions, or how that was dealt with because that's maybe one of the challenges of this form compared to the other two that you mentioned.
I think we decided quite early on that we wanted everything in there somehow.
Yeah.
Not necessarily totally discussed. But I mean,
some record of it.
In the list of everything?
Yeah, there is a list of everything.
There's
Yeah.
everything is at least small
Mention.
postage stamp size in the list of everything.
Yeah.
I think.
I mean, maybe that is a response
Interesting.
partly to the problem of the archive in the
Yeah.
studio as
Yeah.
well. That
Yeah, the list of everything's chronological.
Yeah.
But it did throw out that thing about accessing, as an outsider going in to access Greg's old work wasn't easy. And it wasn't all in one place or
Well,
anything.
I guess the particular question.
No sketches. That would be the only thing
I'm
that-
wondering if there's kinds of work, or what I would argue with your body of work is, in fact, the production of catalogs, other books, and essays are the work
That's true. They are in
alongside
there, yeah.
buildings. Those are cut out in a form that's actually quite within the format we know of a monograph, which is keep the emphasis on the thinking and production of the physical stuff. And in fact, this interesting process you're talking about the production of the book itself is also, I think, largely excluded, which
Yeah.
again is something we find within the history of the book, of the monograph form. How it comes about is often a bit of a black box. We have the beautiful sort of thing at the end, and I think what that provokes with this body of work, as I was thinking it through, is that of course so much of what you're showing is the techniques, the tools, the production of projects, and not simply the finished result. And I'm wondering if there's an interesting story in there. Maybe it's the attachment to this book, which could be quite nice.
Well, there were
about
projects that were about to be finished that aren't in it, but mainly because they weren't finished.
Yeah, it was also nice actually. Like
To
there was
have
a discussion: do we wait till the Bloom House is photographed to put it in the book? And for me, psychologically, it was nice to end with an unfinished thing. So,
I think there was an issue about where you cut the book off,
yeah,
because there's so many projects ongoing
it's
that are
true.
kind of
There's a
creeping
lot of
in.
stuff that's
That list of everything kept growing.
Was it an internal or an external decision? Did Rizzoli just say, look, we're going to get it to press?
they weren't that interested
Yeah.
at that
No.
level. I
Yeah.
don't think.
I think there was pressure from them to have everything. I think in terms of marketing, they want it to be the monograph with
Definitive,
everything.
yeah.
Yeah. But it's
And you-
also sorry.
And you said you didn't want to do another one for about 10 years.
Yeah.
But,
Still don't.
the publisher has a different. The publisher work quite a few months in advance. They want to get it out to the booksellers quite a long time in advance. So it's important for them to actually have a publishing date. And in this case, it was pushed back with a year, I think, in the end. Yeah.
About a year.
Yeah.
But I think also it threw up, there's this interesting thing about working with a publisher that actually wants to sell the books and make money rather than someone who just produces it as a sort of vanity monograph. And we'd been very conscious that we didn't want to kind of get involved in that and wanted to work with a publisher who would promote the book and try and sell it and try and get it into people's hands. Because I think a lot of architecture books end up being like really niche publications.
But I don't know the industry well enough, but there's Animate Form, last year anyways, sold more copies than the year it was released.
Produced,
It's, every year it sells more. And what we kept telling Rizzoli anyway to get more money for things is like, oh, that's going to happen again with this. But I actually, I didn't want to do a book that would be on everybody's desks for a year. And then, you sell whatever's left to the remainders and then you don't look at it again. And I think that's it. I got a lot of pressure from people wanting to do huge first editions. Like, if you'll do this, we'll do an edition of 25,000, and we're going to have to sell 25,000 the first year, and then they just disappear. And I think what everybody was trying to do that was in the thing was write in a way, or make a contribution in a way, or edit it, or design it in a way that it would have a little more longevity and not have to be that big, like
Event.
get reviewed and everything, and really push it hard the first 6 months and then let it evaporate. So, but for people that are doing architectural publications, that seems more like the business model as far as I can tell, just because I had so many conversations like that. You got to push a huge launch, and then it disappears, rather than something that's a document that people would. I mean, I don't know how many times I said, like, I want a book that people would read, not look at. And it seems like a lot of things are more. It's also the world, the late 90s book, you'd assumed everybody was going to read, and you actually worked on the text. And then there was a thing where it was more like, it was more like putting together a car engine or something. Like, could you put the right vocational information in the document so that people could push the buttons in the correct order to reproduce the things in the pages? And I didn't want to do that. I think right now it's a little bit of a weird vacuum right now, that it's neither books for reading and it's a little bit instruction manuals, but there's, I don't know, it's a weird time for publications.
It seems that that's one thing that the 9 topics allow is an opportunity to sort of either imagine or grow different kinds of audiences. I think the most striking thing I found in it was the introduction of fiction deliberately as a, in a monograph, in an architectural monograph especially, it's not a form of writing one encounters often. And your deliberate decision to pick, and the book ends with 3 fictional pieces, and the final one is Greg's, but also J.G. Ballard's and Bruce Sterling, am I right? Is the other one? Yeah, I mean, the introduction of a different category, a different kind of word. It's not just the balancing of word and image, which I would argue in architectural discussions has been a kind of long-running story, but that in fact there are different kinds of images that can be worked with, as you show, from Polaroids to
Well, it's just
technical
the voice.
documents, and also the words. I mean,
I found myself writing things like, in the future, robots will make our buildings.
Yeah.
In the future, and at a certain point, you get tired of always saying, like, I promise. So instead, I just thought, why not write the robots are making
sounds like
the buildings?
a Kraftwerk song. Yeah,
No, but so that's why the science fiction voice is just
Yeah.
so much easier than the architect is theorist of their own future voice.
Yeah.
Which I just found myself doing and didn't like the sound of it. So.
Maybe we're at a moment. Should we open it up for conversation? Questions from the field. Can we do that?
Can I do a survey? I have some questions for students. As I came and looked around the bookshop yesterday, and came to my own conclusions about some of the books that were recent titles and some of the older books that I liked, and I only walked away with one book. How many of you have bought an architecture book in the last week? And how many have bought, let's say, in the last 3 months?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's amazing.
All right. How many of you have spent more than £50 on a book in the last 6 months? On any
This is
book.
like a Rizzoli.
That's why Rizzoli loves this room.
Okay. How many of you have spent
3 minutes.
more than £50 on a non-architectural book? Almost the same.
Huh.
Do you mean one book, 50
One
pounds?
book. Yeah, one
Mhm.
book worth with the price of more than £50. Okay. What? How many of you haven't bought an and you have to fess up to this? How many of you have not bought an architecture book in the last 3 months? So it's funny. There are some people who aren't raising their hands. How many of you like the kinds of books that are compilations under a theme, like Infill or, I don't know, very tiny microcosmic toilets or whatever, whatever a publisher thinks of. They call up architects, they get the pictures for free, they hire some graduate student to write captions. I'm not painting a very nice picture of these books, and it's okay to like them. I have some too.
It could be like inflatable architecture or something.
Yeah, just the kind of stuff that it's. How many of you like it? It could be for any reason. Either you like to look at them, or they're a good resource, or it's stuff you can't find online and you might not have known about. How many of you like those kinds of books?
Yeah, how many people get them for Christmas from their parents?
I don't understand. Those books sell incredibly well. They sell in 8 or 10 languages. That's that's the bread and butter for publishers like Lawrence King and
Tigerstolsen.
yes, exactly. And it's not just architecture; it's graphic design, and they're kind of fiction. There's no real thinking. There's no rigor in those books.
Well, I think there's been a trend since, I mean, the end of print was declared in the mid-90s. And since then, particularly all design field, architecture and graphic design and product design has had an absolute explosion of books. And one of the things that is happening is that as soon as, at least in graphic design, as soon as there's some kind of trend going on that is start to be visible, within 2 years of it starting, there will be a book out that is, like you say, it's a collection of stuff that is being printed, and it's like a teaching, old-style teaching book. It's just that you get it straight away. So it's a good source for students to just see, okay, this is what is going on now. So it becomes, and it's the same thing with, I don't know, I haven't seen the toilet book, but I'm sure it's good. It sounds interesting.
That was a fiction, but there is a very good book about toilets that
Absolutely.
that Merrill Holberton, I think, Merrill Publishers published, which is a couple of people who went around photographing a lot of toilets around the world and very agricultural places, and I recommend that one. But it's frustrating sometimes. It's frustrating sometimes, and I think, but at the same time, you can't go into a bookshop like the AA bookshop or Zwemmer's or Koenig's and fail to see that the level of thought that goes into graphic design and art direction and font design now compared to 10 or 15 or more years ago is significant. I mean, there's like my problem is really with the editorial strategies that invent these books and these ideas, not necessarily with the art direction. I mean, I was really impressed yesterday by a couple of the AA publications now, which seem to be publications where the book isn't designed in a self-conscious way, and where the books they need to exist as books. You can only navigate through them in a particular way that you couldn't, where you can't see and navigate and make associations between things and feel it in your hands. You can't do that on a website, and it was reassuring to see those things.
No, we're
just your in-house publishers.
No, we're very interested in it. In fact, along similar lines to what's been discussed here, which is to reinvent an old form and to not confuse that form with the other new media, which we're also very interested in, but operate in different ways. And I think the sad example of books emulating websites, which we all know very well, is a good one of one medium simply not transferring or translating as simply as people might have thought 10 years ago when everybody took it to be the natural next step. And I think the idea of just a simple direct form of communication, and the book has clearly played a very long disciplinary role in what we take to be architectural knowledge, makes it, again, an interesting topic because of these other media examples out there. Not to emulate them, but to actually reframe how we understand the word. Our AA word series here is deliberately just meant to get architects and people close to architecture to argue through words and not images, let's say, in an era of Photoshop. And we know that world and in fact have a great deal of understanding and control of it, but there's this other form also which is quite interesting, and that seems to be absolutely on the table with this kind of a production, that interplay between word and image. You touched very briefly on the topic of a global audience, and thinking of Rizzoli, which we know is one of the great global publishing empires, and I presume are distributing the book worldwide, which helps set the figures for print runs, etc. Was there ever a discussion about languages? I mean, we've chosen English, which is actually a small part of the human population, and I'm wondering, is there already a conversation with Mandarin, Hindi, or any other languages that architects are looking at this kind of work through today?
I'm not involved in any of that, and I don't know that it's been raised. I mean, as a matter of course, publishers like Rizzoli will show the book to foreign language publishers.
Yeah.
But I'm not aware of any discussions that have taken place, or what the nature of the discussions would have been. They will have taken place.
Second language rights, distribution, any of that been talked about?
No, they wanted to own all the.
Yeah.
They wanted to own
I would
all that.
think. Yeah.
But I mean, that whole world seems to have changed a bunch. In fact, Rizzoli doesn't distribute it exclusively, I don't believe.
I'm sure they use agents.
Well, they use other publishing
Editors.
companies and
Yeah.
sales agents in different territories to do it. But these days, for a book like this, unless it's a book that can be produced cheaply and has other low common denominator qualities, you might as well publish in English. Even 15 years ago or 12 years ago, when I was in Japan doing research for the Paul Smith book and talking to Japanese publishers there, because Paul is a rock star. You can't walk down the street in Tokyo, and that was even a long time ago. And I thought for sure that I would get a co-edition with a Japanese publisher and sell loads of copies. And in the end, not only would they not publish it in Japanese, they preferred to have it in English. And even then, they didn't sell very many. So it was a very curious thing. I think there's sometimes having it in China, Japan, even in Germany, a book can sell just as many copies in English as it would in the local language. It doesn't really make a difference.
I think it's more text. It's more textbooks that are smaller volumes and cheaper price, more educational books rather than the sort of heavy monograph books. Yeah.
The other thing that's, not quite as big as this, but I've gotten portfolios that are published, self-published hardcover portfolios all the time.
Yeah.
So there is something about books now which they're real available. I mean, it's not just that there's so many new books after the end of print, but that actually everybody's publishing all kinds of their own books.
And a few years back, having a monograph was more kind of a historian's. It's almost entering history, whereas that is not the case anymore. You have practices that have just been working for under a decade, and then they give out a monograph that is self designed and self-edited. So it becomes their kind of way of. It's a glorified brochure, and a lot of them. So it is a whole. You can't look at books in the same way at all anymore.
And publishers are terrified. I mean, the big publishers, even big illustrated book publishers, not just trade publishers like Random House and Transworld, they're terrified about the future. You may or may not read about what's going on, but all the trade publishers are making waves of redundancies. One trade publisher has just decided as a policy not to publish any colored books, not to print any books in color until further notice. They're terrified, and it's a combination of all different kinds of things. Globalization in the terms of territories. Most big publishing companies will publish it, like Rizzoli did with this one, a book for the world market, and they distribute using local agents. There's no kind of American publisher, UK publisher. There's a lot less of that, and then there's all the digital media and the internet, and that's free. Speeds are faster than they've ever been and getting faster all the time. Resolution, screen resolution, portability, all those factors are having a huge impact on illustrated book publishing. And it's the people in this room, younger people who are buying books, who will set the pace for that amount of change. These days, even I buy very few books, and they have to really pass a lot of tests. And sometimes only one test is enough. It's the only book on the subject, or it's the most complete one, and you don't need any of the others. But it's all changing. And for years, I remember in the mid-'90s, I worked on a book with Bill Viola. It was a collection of his writing, so it's a book that you read. And like Animate Form, it's a text with illustrations, and you read it. But even then, talking to Bill about, wouldn't it be great if we could read this book with the moving image?
Yeah.
And it won't be long before you can. I mean, there are Mylar platforms where you can look at 480 by 640 resolution video images that you could bind into a book, and all you need is a little CPU, and you could look at this stuff. You could look at, like online. And this is where the questions arise for the publishers. Should they invest money in investigating these new Sony readers, the ebooks, and other platforms that might be suitable for illustrated books, or do they just stick to web-based media, where you can do a 360 visit of one of Greg's buildings? You just have to upload it, and everybody can see it for free. So yeah, great time to be involved in publishing, and scary. But it's great to observe from a distance, because I do a couple of books a year, and it has its own microeconomy, and if that microeconomy works, I can do it, and I'm not threatened by that.
Yeah.
But the kinds of books that get published by MIT and Rizzoli and Thames and Hudson and Bristol, and that's all going to change.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that the book is doing, this renaissance of the printed monograph or monograph-length document of a studio or an office, is that it's keeping alive to a certain degree disciplines, and I'm thinking architectural editing especially, which are absolutely under attack. I mean, in a way, the book is the vehicle for keeping alive the idea of editing within architectural discourses and knowledge. And at a time in which all editors are today threatened, whether you work for the New York Times or for progressive architecture in the States. In fact, one of the things that this is doing is keeping that form of expertise within the discipline. And I would argue for a discipline that's long been shaped with that knowledge as part of the conversation. If you think of the famous role that, the kind of work that Beatrice's research has studied, of Cord, Mies, Max Biel, we could go on and on with the list of innovators within architecture who form ideas through the act of editing at a certain level. And it's not just the transferal, but the keeping alive of editing or graphic design as a discipline in relation to architecture.
I think it's also about this idea of there being facts, because if I Googled up one of Greg's buildings on the internet, I bet you I could get 7 different dates. In fact, when we were editing, this is one of the problems, trying to check a fact like that. And I think books still have an important role to play, true or false, in being sort of arbiters of what the facts are.
Yeah.
For instance, on a magazine website, I can spin a rumor that can be completely untrue, but all over the world in about 5 seconds. And we have a lot of trouble checking artworks, architectural products online, just because you never know where to get a correct fact from.
Yeah, and also stuff that is online is there and then it's gone, a lot of it. I mean, there's a lot of websites that used to be around from 3 years ago that you can't find anymore. So it's just, things just disappear. So if for that sake, books have a different role. And also, but the internet works in the same way that media and news work. It feels like you are constantly being updated because there's constantly something new. So it's not really, the internet is not inviting you to be in depth about anything, but it really make you feel like you get to know a lot, and it's constant. You could probably just continue doing research on one topic day after day and find something new.
So depth and permanency still alive.
And
Keeping them within the discipline, within
The places where I teach, I would say a lot of the students have never been to the library. Never.
Yeah.
And so you'll say, like, go find a plan of Fletchen's, and they'll say, there's nothing online. Or no, it's pretty amazing. And I think it really shapes the discourse a lot. I think.
Absolutely.
I mean, that combined with, I believe, a resurgence of the architect as editor of their own work. I mean, I think SML XL was the graphic designer as editor and the architect as editor, and that was an amazing document. But how quickly that spun off into AMO, where that then gets put under the house. The editing gets put under the house. I think it's it's tricky, and I think a lot of it is because people have to manage their own websites and things, which is a big burden, actually, to keep a website fresh or something like that.
Well, we found that when we were doing the book, and I was trying to check stuff, right?
Yeah.
On your website.
Yeah, it was so annoying. I just ripped the thing down. But no, it's really, I think that the web book thing is something that architects are really struggling with and trying to figure out, where do you stop, where do you start, how much do you keep it all in-house, and how much do you have somebody design it, and do you have somebody edit it, and do you have PR people doing it for you, and do you do your own PR, and all that kind of stuff. It's very much in flux. I mean, some things still don't change. I think a lot of people try to do that all in-house, but
Questions before we finish? Anybody?
Hi, Greg.
Here, could I hand that across?
After done the book,
If you flip
I
that on.
assume, after done the book, I assume that I think that's going to change your practice on your teaching. Maybe you could tell a little bit what things you rolled out and what you're moving forward.
No, I think the big change is you just like it does act like a little bit of an archive, where it is easier to, you're not, let's say, having to ship out as many images all the time, or somebody will say, I'm doing a thing on microscopic toilets, and the one on page 99 looked really small. Could you send me one of those? And you can then some things do turn into archival work. But I always work, I like to not cannibalize, but keep a few things going over a long period of time and go back to things. Like right now I'm really into primitive polygon modeling and the way that polygons and curved surfaces can work together. And so we'll go back and, look at things that we were doing 10 years ago and try to figure out how to keep, make something fresh by going back and looking at something. So for me, it's not really so much like you close the book and start doing new stuff. And I think teaching-wise, the teaching I do tends to be with students for long periods of time. So it's not so much like, all right, we got 10 weeks. Hi, I'm Greg. Here's my monograph. Everybody, I used to do that more. Now I tend to teach people for 3 years or 5 years or something like that. So it's not, I haven't even noticed the book around, like on students' desks and stuff. So, and I for sure have never been like, hey, look at that. But no, it is nice to know that like some of the stuff that was on some 15-year-old machine that we'd never be able to open again got opened, or it's helped with some of that.
Yeah.
I think I really understand what happened internally within how to publish book, because since I have experience for last 10 years to publish some books in architecture. My question is to Greg. Book is one of the tool to communicate architecture. My question is what exactly you like to communicate for your reader with your monograph of the form book? Especially you said even your students not really like to read anymore for this time. So, and the second for Robert, since you already survey us, I'd like to ask you, yeah, you already mentioned about the decline of the publication business. What do you think? Is it going to be like a newspaper with decline and collapse and dead?
Do you think the same will happen to newspapers?
Yeah.
Is that what you're asking me? Oh, I don't know. I'm not involved in that kind of media.
Yes.
So I don't know. But I don't buy the paper that much. I get my online thing from the newspaper. The headlines sent to me. And yeah.
I think most newspapers are in trouble right now in the US and here, mainly because most of their readership's online, but most of their revenue from advertising is in print. And so they're kind of stuck between the two things.
Oh yeah, maybe and one thing, your goal with this book. So thank you.
Well, one of the reasons that's the way it is going to somebody like Chris Bangle and saying, architects would really be interested to know that, say, most first-year car studios do a transformation of an architecture into a car. So they'll say, okay, take a Zaha building or take a Frank Gehry building, or I was even very flattered they took Greg Lynn buildings, and they said, turn it into a car. Like, figure out how they put things together, how they make shapes, figure out how to interpret that as an automobile. And I just thought, you know, you even know who we are, like you're interested in architecture, and they always have been, and I thought that architects would like to hear that from automobile designer. And I also thought that we're sharing a medium that we design with the same tools they design with, and there's much more of that now than there was 20 years ago or even longer, that everybody's using the same media again. So you can talk to a graphic designer or a Hollywood special effects person or a naval architect, and you can all say, like, you know, what fillet command are you using in Maya? And they'll all know what you're talking about. And so the bringing in people with some expertise, like under that world, like the mathematicians, as well as people in other fields, I thought it was interesting for the architects to hear their voices, because they're people I talk to all the time, and I like to hear their voices, so I thought, capture it. I still don't know if other people would be interested in the architecture side of it, but I kind of hoped, well, maybe somebody that's not an architect would want to read, you know, what the relationship between architects and automobiles or Hollywood film or science fiction might be. So I was really a lot thinking about the audience, primarily the architectural audience, and bringing them, you know, other influences, but also as a byproduct, you know, other audiences that might get interested in architecture. And I think it is ironic that architecture's, I don't know how much longer I can keep saying it, but it is a hot discipline. I mean, it's a hotter discipline than most. So when you go talk to a sculptor, they have lots of opinions on architecture, and they actually define themselves against architecture in a lot of cases. Or same thing, a lot of fields are very attentive to architecture. I don't know why, but they seem to know what we're doing and follow what we're doing. So, you know, it seemed like a good time to try to make some of those connections more explicit. But yeah, I do think about the audience and also think about them reading stuff rather than, I mean, maybe I don't trust the audience to look at things and understand what they're looking at, but I do trust an audience to read something and have, you know, get provoked or think about things differently. And a book, for me, is something you read. I mean, in general. I mean, a catalog of an exhibition is something you look at, and a book is something you read. And so I think of the audience as a reader rather than a looker.
Thank you all for coming up today for that. Thanks for the conversation, Greg. Thanks for coming in and visiting us. Thank you, everybody, for coming in. And just to remind you, this evening, Phyllis Lambert is in to show her film. You don't know?
My God, like the whole world is
Yeah,
deciding on London tonight.
she's in this evening. Join us for that. We think we're going to show the film at about 6 o'clock. And at the end of the week, a reminder, we're going to do another book launch. Hernan Diaz Alonso is in with the new Demi monograph from China that's just arrived. So thanks, everybody, for coming in. Thank you, guys.